Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Antony.
And this is Words and Numbers. We're here today with our friend Josh Nichols because of something incredibly stupid Antony said not too long ago when I said we're now affiliated with the Center for American Culture and Ideas, and Antony asked what the hell that meant, and I answered, and he said, and I quote, "You mean the snooty stuff."
You said high culture, and I said, what do you mean by high culture? And you didn't give me an answer, so I said the snooty stuff. But before we get to the snooty stuff, you haven't given us any background on Joshua.
We'll do what we always do and read Josh's
No, because that means more work for me later on.
That's exactly what that means. Well, my friend Josh is not only a composer, but he's actually quite a good composer. I've had the utter privilege of listening to some of his works performed live, and I will say that not only are they wonderful, they're moving. In the show notes, we'll leave links to some of Josh's work. Josh, you'd be happy to provide those, I would assume?
Yes, happy to.
I can give him higher praise from the perspective of an economist, because before you came on, Josh said that he's a musician who's paid to write music. And that's got to be an incredible rarity. The market thinks Josh is superb.
Well, it's an odd market, and it's something I want to cover today. There's a few things I was hoping we would cover. First, the snooty stuff, what is it? Mm-hmm. Second, what are the economics of classical music today? And how does a composer or a musician negotiate those waters? How does one actually make a living in a market that's, I think, downright hostile to the very idea of creating something of enduring worth and beauty? So we'll take those in turn. But I do actually want to start with the snooty stuff, right? Why should we care? Why is Antony so disheveled when he even tries to think about this sort of thing? I will say that Josh, once he heard Antony say that, immediately sent me an email and said, well, could I maybe come on and explain this to you people?
Josh is coming down from on high to explain high culture, the snooty stuff.
That's right. That's right.
And I thought that's probably for the best. Somebody needs to, but then I thought, wouldn't it also be nice for people who don't think about this kind of thing on a regular basis? Maybe it would be interesting for them to hear about the economics of this world, because they are interesting economics. And I think in a lot of ways harken back to the history of classical music. But we'll get to that when we get to that. Josh, what do we need to know about the snooty stuff?
Involved in my work at the Center for American Culture and Ideas is primarily thinking and writing music. I've been thinking about this for a long time. This has been my vocation since I was in undergrad. I didn't take a switch or anything like that in major course of work. So I have always been attracted to this. And really this started when I was in high school. I was in high school band. I played the trombone, and the oboist came up to me after a rehearsal or sometime, I don't remember exactly when. He knew that I was interested in piano and piano music. And he said, have you ever heard of Rachmaninoff's Third Piano Concerto? And I'm going to say, I heartily commend it to your audience if they're interested in something completely different and new than what they're probably used to. And I said no, and God bless you, because I thought he sneezed. And I went straight to Barnes & Noble and got the first record I got my hands on, which was this young hotshot pianist from Israel named Evgeny Kissin playing live with the Boston Symphony Orchestra, the entire thing. And I was as shocked and awed by it as the live audience that was there, that you could clearly hear in the recording after everything was said and done. It was one of the most fantastic recordings I've ever heard. Still really one of my favorite recordings ever. Ever since then, this enterprise of high culture, of classical music, of classical art has been a major part of my life. So the snooty stuff is what traditionally people think of when they think of powdered wigs and Downton Abbey and things pre-20th century, really.
Chamber music.
Yeah, chamber music, cavorting along and, bowing in grace, how do you do kind of thing. and swords and all kinds of other things. But what they're identifying through such a reference is this idea that there is this world outside of what we consider popular culture that exists kind of unto itself. There's not really a rhyme or a reason that people can sense. It's just there. And so there are a bunch of these old people that travel in droves to these big spaces, kind of like rock and roll stages, big venues, but kind of smaller. And they watch hundreds of people get on stage and bow, and everybody claps and wears a tie and that sort of thing. And all they see are the references, the visual references of this cultural thing. And in reality, it goes much deeper than that. For lack of better terms, snooty stuff is really just classical art. And that takes its form in music, in visual art that's painted or otherwise drawn or manifest physically. There's the theater and the stage. There's also dance, ballet, that sort of thing. All of this comes together in this very unique subculture, which, like you were implying, James, is one of the roughest economic places you could be. I'd actually argue that there's really not an economy in classical art. There is a benefactorial system or benefactorial system. I guess is the word I'm looking for.
This is what I wanted to get back to, right? This is the model that has almost always been in place for classical music, right? There were patrons, and this harkens back to the time of monarchs and empires.
Yes.
Right. If not that, then it was going to be the church, right? And if you know anything about Bach made his living from the church, writing music for the church.
Yeah.
So
to his chagrin.
How does it work? Yeah, sure. And I would say probably rightfully so in a lot of ways, right? But if it was monarchs and churches once upon a time, it's certainly not that anymore, even if the broader model holds. So who are the patrons at this point?
Well, see, here's the thing that a lot of people don't understand is, by and in large part, with the democratization of economics, really the middle class expanding through the 19th century, we have the focus of monies, of wealth, being transferred back down into the middle class, because now they're participating in ordinary life, that which was previously only for the elite. Because what do elites have that peasants and middle class folk don't have? They have time. They literally have time, because they have everyone else do all the work for them. If you're a middle class peasant or a low class peasant, all you're doing is break back work. That's all you're doing day in and day out. You're either on the farm, raising the chickens, plowing the fields, breaking your back, and then beating yourself against the sun, or raising tons and tons of children that hopefully one of them will continue and keep on the business, because without it, you would die. You would literally die. So with the rise of the middle class in the 19th century, you really have this growing sentiment that now more people can partake in this cultural experience that was only really reserved for the elite. So the people that are giving money to support this enterprise of classical music, they're still wealthy. These are wealthy individuals, but there are more of them with less money between all of them. So essentially, instead of one monarch or one benefactor or one member of the Medici family giving what is equivalent of a few $100 million over a course of 50 years to support an organization or a class of artists, it's now tens of thousands of people with a few $1 million each that all take an interest in this enterprise. Ticket sales are the great misnomer of classical music. A lot of people think that classical music benefits off of ticket sales, and that is just not the case. If you imagine what a Taylor Swift ticket costs, they go for thousands and thousands of dollars. And yet, when you look at Taylor Swift's overall cost, they're spending most of their money on traveling and putting this thing together. Now, granted, she's taking a great cut because she's a very popular individual and people will flock in droves to see her from all over the place. But still, the bottom line is there's a lot of cost involved in supporting an artist like that. Now take the 7 to 10 musicians that are on a Taylor Swift concert tour, and you spend anywhere from a few $100s to a few $1,000s on a ticket, and there are 10,000 people in the audience at each of these venues. There's 10 venues, right? Now multiply that by 100 musicians and shrink the amount of room that people can come in and listen, divide it in half or into 3. And all of a sudden you have an existential problem. Ticket sales will not pay for this enterprise. It just will not.
And you don't get Taylor Swift ticket prices either.
No, not at all. And it has never been the case that classical music tickets have been a substantial portion of how an artistic venue like a symphony orchestra has been in business. Most of these symphonies are not in a business. They are not for profit. They are most of the time nonprofits because they can't keep the overhead necessary from selling whatever their wares are between tickets and other things, gift shop items. They can't make enough money on simply that. So you look at the back of a playbill, and what do you usually see? You see a list of all of the benefactors who have given at least $50,000 or at least $10,000 or at least $5,000 or at least $500. And you see all of their names. They don't tell you how much they gave, but you can see clearly who's invested in keeping that organization afloat. But there's also this other reality, which is lots of symphonies have closed in the last 20 to 30 years, and it has always been the case. Symphonies are always closing down. We had a decade of decadence in the latter part of the 19th century where some of the biggest orchestras existed, whether it was in Vienna or in the New York Philharmonic, the Chicago Symphony. They all had big orchestras. And then World War I hit, and basically it's been a steady decline of orchestras basically falling apart and disunionizing. There's an elephant in the room. If you'd like to ask another question.
What's the other elephant in the room?
The other elephant in the room is, and maybe Ant is thinking of this, is, well, why do something that wastes so much money? It costs so much money to do this. The enterprise itself is about as inefficient as some governments are, since we're talking about markets and things like that. There's lots of bureaucracy. There's people talking down each other's throats, trying to decide what next piece to promote. It's a bunch of dead people's music, oftentimes. This
dead
doesn't
seem.
Yeah, dead white people. That's right, which is unfair. I don't know if Viennese people such a thing.
I don't know. A lot of those guys are dead and white, Josh.
That's right.
But look, let's not play fast and loose with it. Okay. The economics of it aren't what people might think, right? It's not ticket sales, but there is a market for this. Therefore, it exists. Mm-hmm. It's just a different kind of market. I
would argue that on the whole, between classical and jazz, it has lingered between 2.5% and 3% of the overall music market. And it has been like that since we started collecting information on that in the 20th century. So when Billboard got started, that's when they started collecting information about all of this. And popularity has never been a strong suit of classical music. But endurance has. Endurance, that's exactly right. Let's use deduction here and say, well, if it's not the money that makes it viable, and it's not the fact that there's all these living composers that are recording, like a modern producer for an album, for example, if it's none of these things, then what is its value? And its value is exactly like you've put it. It's in longevity, which is to say part of its identity is not as an enterprise or an entrepreneurial enterprise, but as a monument of preservation of a certain type of art. This is where Snooty comes back to play.
I'm thinking about the economics here, and one or the other of you said something that piqued my interest. You referred back to several centuries ago, the model, and we still have it, the model of patron and musician. The rich patron would pay for the musicians to compose and all of this stuff. And if you think back to that period, there was a similar model with, I'll say broadly, entrepreneurs, but I'll give you an example of architects. So you had the same thing. The monarch or the church were patrons to architects, and what would they do? They'd build the cathedrals or the castles and this sort of thing. And that model changed of patron entrepreneur to investor entrepreneur.
Mm-hmm.
And so now, if I've got an idea, I've got some new product or whatever it is, I want to build a building, I can go out, I can find investors to pay for the thing. So it's a democratization of that. That, I argue, can't happen with classical music for a couple of reasons. Recorded music itself is what we would call a public good, that if I've got a recording, I can copy it and give it to people and they benefit from that, and you don't get, the musician doesn't get any benefit. But worse than that, the music you're playing isn't covered by copyright.
Yes, that's right.
I would argue that classical music today is stuck in the patron-composer model because it's a massive public goods problem. You can't monetize. It's not that the thing doesn't have market value, it's that you can't realize the market value because there are no property rights anywhere.
Well, that's not exactly true, right? There's no property rights in, say, Mozart, but there are property rights in Joshua Nichols. What he composes, he controls the copyright. And still, given the vagaries of the music business, it's not going to work.
You overcome that one problem of lack of copyright when Joshua writes something, but you don't overcome the other problem, which is if I've got a copy, I can copy it and give it to friends.
Yeah.
And yet, any number of musical acts have gotten around that problem by appealing directly to their fans and saying, look, you need to support us or we're not going to be able to do this anymore.
Yeah, your beloved Marillion, for example.
They do this all the time, right? They started their own record label. They put together weekends where we all go to see them live and, they make a comfortable living and we get the product that we want. That's more difficult with composers, right? Because as Josh says, how many people do you need on that stage in order to recreate the music he's written?
Right. Yeah.
And now you've got an economic problem that's not going to be solved with ticket sales, and it's got to be solved some other way. And we led off by saying that Josh, God bless him, makes a living composing.
Mm-hmm.
So what we know is that it's possible in a condition in which it's quite difficult. How is it possible? How do you do this?
I'll be the very first to admit that this is an embarrassment of riches for me. I'm doing something that many people dream of doing. A lot of this has to do with who you know. I mean, I think that's true of a lot of different things. It's pretty much the case, and especially in artistic endeavors, it really matters who you know and how you sell yourself. My band director in high school used to always say, there was this interview portion of the upper ensembles, the bigger ensembles, the nicer ensembles. We did harder music and all that stuff. And there was a short little interview, and he always used to say this to everyone. He said, you never think you are coming to that interview to sell yourself. Think of yourself as always being interviewed throughout all of your interaction throughout the school year, because that's what I'm taking stock in. I'm seeing your behavior. I'm seeing who you interact with. I'm seeing the way that you promote yourself. And that's playing into the interview more than the questions I ask you when I ask you them. So it's the same thing here, and people flock with like people. And so you'll find really out there, edgy classical music that, surprise, surprise, everyone kind of shares the same kinds of values and have the same tastes and say the same things. And then you have people like me who might be associated with like-minded individuals as well. Yeah, it is an embarrassment of riches, but my views about art have had to come down somewhere other than the economics of it. But it's this cultural thing. And y'all touched on that in the episode that I wanted to address.
In the episode in which I pissed you off.
Yeah, no, you didn't piss me off. You didn't piss me off. That's fine. I just thought, this is my chance to jump on this issue. So at that moment, you said something. I think it was James actually that said, politics is always downstream from culture. Analyzing people's behaviors on a political level start first with the unmentionable things that go into how they live their lives and what they do with their time. And I pointed to this earlier on in this idea of the middle class being democratized and becoming more wealthy in the 19th century. Something happened during that time as well. We had the rise of the two first literal superstars of classical music, Franz Liszt and Niccolò Paganini. Franz Liszt was a very, very famous pianist, and Paganini was a very famous violinist. And for what it's worth, Paganini has been thrown under the bus, but a lot of people could just marvel at him and think he must have sold his soul to the devil or something. Nobody can play the violin like that and not have done something. So there's this thing happening in society. We're automating a lot more. We have easier access to ironwork, right? We don't have to wait on the blacksmith to make me parts and put together things. We have flat tables, iron tables that allow us to measure things with very, very precise measurements that now allows us to create these machines that can work for us. Well, what happens when humanity comes across that? They get free time. And it's always a question of what do you do with free time? What I would argue is the primary benefit of classical music, above and beyond this conversation about the economics of it, is what it does with free time. And a lot of people would say, well, free time is free time. Who cares what I do with it? And that's your prerogative. I'm not going to sit here and try to chastise you for what you do with your free time. But one thing I find is utterly necessary as a human being is to do things concurrent with my duties to survive, to thrive. And those things that I do need to involve the mind, need to involve the way we think about things. Because like we were saying, politics is downstream from culture. There are unmentionable, non-tactile things that go into how people think about one another and how groups of people think about each other and how cultures and towns think about each other. And that all involves the mind. And it's this peculiar thing. And this might be a little soft and fuzzy, but I want to try to push us into this just a little bit for the sake of this conversation, that there is something so imperceptibly tangible, but still tangible about the act of being a human being and thinking. And that involves this little word called contemplation. Contemplation involves thinking of things for their own sake. There are many things in life that we take for granted that all involve thinking for their own sake. So, for example, you might have an artisan who builds a table. This is my contrasting image here. He builds a table and it's expertly crafted. It's gorgeous. It's the most beautiful table you've ever seen in the world. Yet what does a table do? It allows you to put things on it, to set up things, to separate things from the ground. It maybe allows you to sit on it. Its purpose is built into its artisanal existence. Now contrast that with gazing up at the stars and contemplating the universe. And I'm not trying to argue for any kind of religious or psychological persuasion here. I just want to bring into the idea that you could gaze at the heavenly bodies and see the stars and just wonder, whatever that means. It may even be a Herculean task. Maybe it's overwhelming. But that act serves only itself. That's all it does. We are thinking about what it means to be human in that moment. The arts before the 20th century, this might be the sticking point here. The arts before that time were primarily about this contemplation, this ability for humans to think and to wonder and to marvel at things which have no tangible purpose other than for their own sake. So this would involve also philosophy. Why on earth would people want to think about what it means to be human? Why write books about it? That is an intangible thing that doesn't make a whole lot of sense in a sort of economic enterprise. But there's something necessarily human about it. There's something that gives it purpose for its own sake. And that's what the arts can do.
I'm glad you ended with philosophy, because that the minute you started down this avenue, that's all I could think of, right? Leisure time is an absolute prerequisite for philosophy, and philosophy is an absolute prerequisite to living the good life. Mm-hmm. And we'll set that aside. I think rational people can agree on that. Postmodernists can go right off. But there's this other element when you start talking about what these things are. I think we're going to be in heated agreement here, but I want to say it in a different way. Art allows us to peel back the curtain in front of our time-bound existence and participate in eternity.
Yeah.
That's where the amazement comes. And that's true of both philosophy and the arts.
There is a temper in the current culture we live in that is doing everything it can to, well, suffice it to say, they're trying to kill off tradition. And I'm not arguing for tradition when I say this, so I want to be careful about that. But what you're saying, James, is exactly right. And to the point that Antony was speaking of earlier, all of this public domain music, and by the way, copyright is really a 20th century thing. If it hadn't been for Disney Corp and a bunch of other entities, we probably wouldn't really have a functioning copyright system. Copyright is a commercial aspect of retaining ownership and rights that allows you to arbitrate. So that's all playing into an economics aspect of it. So it's almost moot when we're considering the value of objects in their artistic purpose. For Ant's point, I would say, well, yes, we play a lot of dead people's music, regardless of their ethnicity, because their value is above and beyond what they can bring in the moment. That's precisely the reason why we do that. Contrast this with commercial music. Commercial music, for all of its, joys and the things that it can bring to enrich life, it necessarily can be boiled down to, and these might be fighting words, but it can be boiled down to an economic system that is exploiting what people want. That's what they want. A producer doesn't get known unless they write something that people want to hear. Now, sometimes they don't know if they want to hear it, so they got to go hear it to see if they like it. But it's still the same enterprise. You're exploiting people's taste, personal values and taste. And I mean that in the most sincere way possible. I'm not saying that negatively. You're exploiting their taste in order to give them what they want. And that is a wonderful way to have an economic system like that. I mean, that's a capitalist dream. It's like we are exploiting the talents and abilities of other people to give the people what they want, our consumers, right? Our customer base. Okay, now let's contrast that with classical art, which in all actuality could care less about who likes it. All of its values are opposite of that of commercial art. That tells us something about its value. So a lot of people would say, well, if it doesn't have any practical value, then it must mean it's just really worthless, except for a bunch of old guys who like to go to the symphony. No. Let's not go down that road quite yet. Let's consider maybe what's hidden in the shadow of those things. So maybe we should start considering values which are above and beyond what might be commercially viable. Maybe we should consider their value and what they bring to humanity. So one of the joys of so-called snooty music, and I mean that playfully, is that snooty music affords a person to look beyond what they're feeling in that moment, to maybe search and contemplate something beyond themselves. I know it's fluffy. It's uncomfortable for people who like to really come down hard and be really precise and articulate about it. But it's there. The opportunity is there. So you're enjoying someone's music. Let's take this for example. Beethoven's Fifth. He lived in the 1700s. He was one of the most popular composers of his time. There were 10,000 people at his funeral. But that was hundreds of years ago. So we're not only disconnected from the man himself, we're abstracted from that. We're also disconnected from his audience because all of his audience is dead. All of it. There's not a single person alive. And not only that, but there's several generations from those people that are also dead that we have no contact with. So we're several degrees of separation and abstractness from that. We're also not hearing the instruments that they were played on or by the musicians and their students, right?
You can hear the instruments, though.
You can hear them, but you can't hear the people that produce them.
Yeah.
Right? And there's an element of approximation because we don't know those people and how they would have taught those violinists to play that violin. There's so many things that are so distant from this time. And here's the beauty of it. We can listen to that symphony and still gain insight and profundity and marvel and awe and get the tingles down our backs and all of that stuff, even though the dude's been dead in the ground 6 feet under for hundreds of years. Its value cannot be its commercial enterprise, although, again, we buy and sell classical records all the time. Not saying that's a bad thing, but its value, its de facto value, the prima facie value of it is in its higher, more transcendent approach. What it offers to the human experience that now Antony, who doesn't know any of those people and don't know Beethoven, and I don't think you don't read music, right, Ant?
Yeah, I do.
You do read music?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, well, that's great. So you could look at a score, but you wouldn't be looking at Beethoven's score. You wouldn't be looking at his handwriting, not that you'd want to. All of these things separate you from it. So that must mean that my personal tastes and values need to be suspended and put adrift, for lack of a better word, so that I can experience something that is higher and above what is ordinary. In the ancient language of Aristotle and Plato, this is precisely what they mean when they talk about the servile versus the liberal arts. The servile versus the liberal arts. And those two things, there's nothing negative implied in those words. The servile arts are the things that give us the ability to have the liberal arts. It's the innovation of man and his industriousness to be able to provide ways of freeing up our time to be thinking about all of these things. I doubt economics as a field would exist today if it wasn't for the innovations, practical innovations that were brought to the fore, right? There are thousands of philosophers in this world when before you couldn't thrive or exist as a philosopher. There's a few hundred over the last few hundred years. And then boom, 20th century hits and everybody's got free time. We can all go to school now. We can go study and have a liberal arts education. It's this beautiful thing that has happened. So I'm inviting the idea into the conversation that maybe the value of high culture is not that you get to participate in this white collar religion of sorts, go to a concert and watch a bunch of people play music and clap at the right time, but that you can actually go and behold something that has transcended time and space and culture itself.
I hear what you're saying, and I don't disagree with it, but it seems that the truth is broader than what I'm hearing you say. That is, the music, the art, can certainly be a trigger to help someone to cogitate the nature of themselves, existence, all of that. But without that person, the art or the music falls flat. It doesn't do anything. I submit that the number of people who would be so moved is not 100% of the population. I was astounded when my wife finally got me to realize one time not that long ago that not everybody likes thinking about things. I said, well, why not? Thinking about things is really cool. She said, no, a lot of people find it actually distasteful to think about things. And so I get what you're saying, but I would submit that what's required for us to consider our existence is in part the trigger of the art or the music, but it's also in part a person who's willing, who's interested in considering that.
Let me echo that wholeheartedly, and that is an aspect of this conversation that has been underserved. In Platonic writings, in Aristotle, in Boethius, you go back to these ancient philosophers, they all say that part of what helps this along, the people to come to this realization, is a strong education. And education is the first liberal art there is. Before music, before architecture, before philosophy, it is education that causes all of this. And so I would wholeheartedly agree with you. You need the people. It's a paradox of the arts, actually, I would say, is you do have this interdependent relationship between a quasi-economic view of people, because it does involve how people choose and not choose certain things over others. But it's also in tandem with philosophy and education. I would agree with you 100%. I think that actually plays into how I think of all of this. There are a couple of books I would heartily recommend to this point. There was a German philosopher in the 1940s. That's not normally a thing people like to hear, but this one you're going to want to hear. His name is Josef Pieper, and he wrote this wonderful book called Leisure, the Basis of Culture. It's one of the great books. He wrote a short introduction on it called Only the Lover Sings, which is a stirring title. It's a very short book. I would commend both of them. If you have less time, go for Only the Lover Sings. And then if you have a little more time, go for Leisure, the Basis of Culture. And in those books, it documents what is essentially the posture of a well-educated person. Another person who spoke really profoundly on this is C.S. Lewis on The Abolition of Man, one of the great books. He's actually addressing literature, but it really well applies. It draws from Taoism, but it's basically you have to have a tempered individual who is leading the mind and the gut through the chest. And men without chests cannot endure. They are insufferable creatures who lead by their fancies and cannot have self-control. He's addressing the Green Book, and the Green Book is trying to do this thing that James was talking about, the postmodernists. When a person writes in a book that the waterfall is sublime, the Green Book was attempting to say there's no such thing. There's just no such thing. That waterfall is making you feel sublime, but it's not actually sublime. And C.S. Lewis was arguing this is the slippery slope of human character and human culture, that we are falling fast down in avoiding this question of relating beauty to the things around us.
My message to the postmodernists, it's not about you. Sorry, it's not about you. But on your larger point, Josh, and I think we'll end here, you've got no greater ally than Socrates himself, who in Plato's Republic, in the allegory of the cave, presenting the role of the philosopher. The philosopher doesn't walk out of the cave, he's compelled out of the cave, meaning to say he can't help but wonder. That's the character type. It's not limited to only a few, but it is limited to a very low percentage. You know, the people who avail themselves of their leisure time in search of the truth or of beauty or of a sublime experience, well, that's not 100%, and it's never going to be. But happily, it is big enough that I think every year I could go see Beethoven's Fifth. I could find a way because it's produced. And I can go and find a CD with your music on it and other people's too. You know, to say there's not a market isn't exactly right. It's just a different kind of market. And on that happy note, I want to encourage our listeners to go out and listen to Josh's music. It's stunning.
Oh, you're very kind.
We'll have a link in the show notes.
And that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Until next time, be sure to follow us on Twitter. Handles are in the show notes. Join Words and Numbers Backstage, the Facebook group where the conversation continues, and
send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
Until next week, try to be nice to one person who doesn't deserve it. Just one. And who knows, it may turn into a trend. Give it a shot. You might feel good about yourself.
You could say you tried.
You tried, that's right. Till next week, can't take it easy.
See you next week, James.